Hello and welcome to the next episode of In the Business of Healthy Masculinity. I'm your host, Gary Turner. Find out more about me at radicality.co.uk. But before we go to our next phase of this wonderful conversation, I want you all to meet and hear from the wonderful Stepheni Mendez. Welcome to the show, Stepheni, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. Yes, I'm excited for our conversation.
Oh, well, you're a relatively new, amazing human being in my network. Very kindly introduced to me by the wonderful Katie. And I would just love for you to let people who are listening on the podcast or watching us on the video cast learn a little bit more about you today, Stepheni, before we go exploring around being in the business of healthy masculinity.
Absolutely. So I am Stepheni Mendez. I have done, I've worked in tech for quite a long time. And like many Americans, that is often how I lead, right? How I'm presented to the world is through my career. But what many people don't know about me is that I actually I had a very interesting childhood. We were nomadic, my family. We lived for about 5 years in a camper and traveled all over the Western United States. My dad was a singer, a gospel singer, and an identical twin. And so we traveled with his band. And I saw a lot of different people. I was around a lot of different people. And it really kind of crafted or formed who I have become as an adult. There were wonderful things about it and one really awful things about it. And it definitely set me on the path that I've been on. And one thing that I didn't have a lot of access to as a kid was community. Both of my parents had big families, lots of siblings. I had tons of aunts and uncles and cousins, but we didn't really see them very often because we were traveling so much and we just weren't around the family. And then I wasn't in school. I was homeschooled, as you can imagine, because we traveled so much. So I learned to be really good at making friends fast. We would be in a church or at a conference for a day or two. And so I would find the closest kid that I could find around my age, and we would make friends really, really fast. And then I would never see them again after that. And back then we didn't have texting and we didn't have the internet really. And so I really just didn't keep up with a lot of people. And so developing community or building community was something I never really learned as a kid. I was really, really close to my sisters, but that was it. So fast forward, I was homeschooled through high school, which is quite a feat, to be honest. And then I went to college, and that was another big, it was a hurdle, and I tested very well for being homeschooled, to be honest, and was really drawn to art and design and computers and all of that world. I started in journalism, but then worked at the newspaper at my university. And the one thing that I liked was laying out the pages. Did not like interviewing people, did not like hunting down leads, but I loved making the pages look great. So that told me something, and I switched to graphic design and eventually would build my career in user experience design. I think the biggest thing that always drew me to design was being able to control how something could develop and appear. But I also was really interested in the psychology of what drove people, what interested people, why would they look at one thing over another thing. So I actually went back to school after I graduated from university. It was around, I think, late 2006, early 2007. And I hadn't had an internship because we were not wealthy and I couldn't afford an unpaid internship. I had to work through school. So I really just worked and did some side work as a designer, and eventually decided, well, I really am interested in people. Let me go back to school. So I did, for psychology. And I, in that program, learned so much more about myself. It's funny, when I started my program, I talked to a woman who was probably a senior in her program. She was about to graduate. And I remember having the conversation because she said, psychology is fascinating because, especially counseling psychology, because you learn so much more about yourself than you do about other people. And she was 100% right. In the 3 years that I did my master's program in counseling, I learned an incredible amount about myself and about the way that different experiences form us. And it started me down this path of really considering and observing humans. But psychology doesn't pay the bills very well. And I made a pivot. I didn't finish my program. I made a pivot back to design, but I started thinking about how people interact with design. And so that's how I built a career in user experience design. And being in a tech environment with a psychology background, a background with growing up, my dad's side of the family is Mexican, my mom's side of the family is German. And so living in those spaces in between, having those kind of intersectional identities, and being in so many spaces with people who had intersectional identities growing up, and observing people in psychology and in my counseling program, observing people throughout my career, holding space in a tech career has been particularly informative experience. Particularly corporate tech, can be very extractive. Mm-hmm. It can be a space where no matter how much you give, it's never quite enough. It's funny because in tech we have this saying, it's not rocket science, or we're not saving lives here. Like it's literally we're designing an application. But a lot of times we did approach it like we were brain surgeons or saving humanity. And when we thought that way, it created this ongoing experience of artificial stress. Deadlines are a huge thing for technology companies, in my experience, but they're almost never real. It's not a situation where like we have until this date and then something terrible happens. It's typically someone up at the top decided that they needed to see something by a certain date, or they wanted to sell it to a certain client by a certain date. And so all the teams are rushing along trying to get this thing done in a minimal amount of time. And what I learned from that, and with my psychology background, with my people observation background, was there's this artificial idea in tech that you fail fast, learn fast. But when you really dig in most organizations that I've been involved in, it's not necessarily the reality on the ground, right? Rather than having a community of people around you where you're safe to experiment, you're safe to fail. It's usually more like intense competition. Who can do the most, do the best, do the fastest? And whoever can typically gets noticed more, which means their career trajectory is better. A woman at the table, then it should be a white woman. it should be me, or it should be this other person that I'm really good friends with. And humans naturally tend to find people like themselves to grow close to, right? That's a natural way that we progress, and that's how it's worked too with men in tech, right? The early days of tech, the idea was you hire somebody that you'd have a beer with. And so it proliferated a bunch of guys who wanted to go have beers together. And that's just a natural, normal progression of the way humans look for things that are the same, that are similar. That's it's kind of like the shadow side of community. That we want to be around the people that we feel comfortable with. What that creates in corporations, though, is homogeneity, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you can't you can't imagine going and having a beer with someone if you don't have anything in common with them, if you didn't have a similar background growing up, if you don't understand what their experience might be out in the world. If so you have these groups of people who come together. So back to my experience of men in tech is white men never saw me as a threat. They didn't need to. I wasn't where they were. And so with being that experience of being in the space with white women, they saw me as a threat. They saw me as someone not quite like them, but also that I could take away their space, their seat that they wanted to work hard for. And so the experience of my career has been one of a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Being closed out of a lot of spaces, not only by men in the workplace, but also by women in the workplace, by women who weren't like me or who didn't perceive that I was like them. And that has led me to the space where I am today. So I started coaching while I was still in my tech job, and I learned so much from the women that I have coached. I've coached all women, mostly from tech careers, tech backgrounds. And what I have heard from them has been some of the most eye-opening and inspiring things that I've ever heard. And that's the most of the women that I've coached have come to me because they felt confused. They felt like they weren't sure what to do, what was next. And yet, whenever we dig in with my psychology background and all the work I've done personally to grow as a human being, we dig in, and what we discover is that they were not confused at all. I have not yet coached a woman who was actually confused. What they were experiencing was they knew exactly what they wanted to build. They knew what they wanted to bring into the world. They knew that they wanted to bring in things that were nourishing, that were slower, not hustle against fake deadlines. They wanted to bring things into the world that were supportive of other people. And the only thing they were confused about is how to survive end stage capitalism in the process. How do you build the future, build what's next, while surviving the situation that we're in that's tied to career, that's tied to money, that's tied to identity?
Mm-hmm.
And that was a huge eye-opener for me. Because I felt it, right? It wasn't confusing to me either, because I'd been there. I have been there for 15 years of a tech career. And let me tell you, building a tech career has been one of the best education that I've ever had. Actually, far more educative than being in school. Like it actually taught me far more. But what it taught me most, again, was about me. It taught me about how I exist in those spaces, about how it feels to not have control over those cycles, over those spaces where I just needed to slow down and just needed to reflect. And this spring, I finally quit tech completely and went into coaching and started a nonprofit, all because I feel like the future is meant for community and not homogeneity, not the shadow side of community where we clump with the people who feel the safest, but community where we can look around at the people around us, recognize our differences, recognize that someone else may have had a very different childhood, a very different experience in their identity. Maybe they were growing up Black in the United States. That's a very specific experience. Maybe they were growing up with immigrant parents. Again, a very different experience. I have people around me in my community now who were the sole translator and interpreter for their families from the age they were 6 or 7. They were learning to read so that they could help their parents understand a legal document that they had to fill out. I have friends who grew up affluent with affluent parents with generational wealth. I have friends who have grown up with next to nothing because their parents barely got an education. So I think when we build that lush community, right? When we build those connections with so many different people, we're able to be introspective in a new way, because we can start to dig in to the pieces that we don't identify in ourselves until we see it reflected in someone with a completely different experience. So that is what has led me to this space, to this moment, is just that understanding that community is everything, but building community with intentionality is really important. It's the most important step that we can take.
What a potent intro, Stephanie. And I think there's so many bits I could pull out. I think there's two things for me. One is that community piece. And I know in my own experience of working within a corporate space, the systems, the old traditional hegemonic systems, are designed to destroy community, particularly across sector, across function, right? It's about stay in your box, stay in your lane, deliver productively within this very narrow version of yourself.
Yes.
And what you're inviting us into and what you've experienced is, no, what we need now, and again, I'll come at this through a healthy masculinity lens, is we need all of us, right? We need to balance those energies. It's not a bad thing, right, to be a man that's driven, that wants to build a business, etc. But how we do it, and let's say how we do it and how we show up and how we give up space, particularly if we're men that are used to taking space, to making decisions on behalf of everybody. How do we practice that? How do we almost practice letting go, particularly men with power? Because a lot of it's let's bear in mind, a lot of it's also unearned, right? Like I've got an awful lot of unearned power within the system just because of what I look like and where I live in the world, right? But I didn't always see that. I didn't understand that. And I think community can help us. Like, if we're in a community space where you feel safe but can get uncomfortable because you feel safe, that's where I feel the juice can come from. What's your experience been of sort of balancing that safety versus discomfort sort of angle of community?
Yes, 100%. It's so interesting that you say that. Right now, I am digging into a book called How to Raise an Anti-Racist. You've probably heard of the Anti-Racist books by Ibram X. Kendi.
Yes.
And he makes a really interesting point, looking at statistics, that babies are born recognizing the race that they're born into. So the race that they see their parents' faces. But when babies and young children are exposed to a diversity of faces, they gain a favoritism for multiple races, for multiple faces around them. When they're not exposed to a diversity of people, when they're in a very homogenous environment, they begin to become less and less comfortable with other races. They don't develop that affinity with other races.
Wow.
There's actually an idea of about that children who grow up in a community that is about 40 to 50% their race versus other races develop a much stronger openness to other races than children who grow up in higher levels of homogeneity. So when you apply that idea to what you're talking about, when your community looks like you develop a kind of blindness to the experiences of others, right? When we talk about color blindness, right, it's kind of a term that releases us from having to pay attention, because color blindness means you're blind to the fact that the people all around you look just like you, that their experiences are so similar to yours. And if you make yourself comfortable in that fact, then you don't actively reach out or grow your community. And if your community looks just like you, then it's a kind of false comfort, right? Because just because the people around you look like you and experience like you experience doesn't mean that there aren't other experiences in the world. And when you can't hear those experiences, when you can't develop that empathy with people close to you, how are you meant to move out into the world and develop it for people out in the greater spaces? How can I feel empathy for someone in Gaza if I've never understood or at least sought to understand the experience of someone who doesn't look like me? I can't, as it like psychologically can't take that in. So I think the diversity of your community is the number one key to being able to reflect to yourself where your biases are, where you can learn, where you can grow. If you don't have that, if you have homogeneity, it's going to be much harder path to learning how to have empathy for more people. And I think what's so interesting right now and so polarizing, especially being in the United States today, and I think we've talked about this in the past, you made a point that it's everywhere, right? It's not just in the United States. I think we're seeing this kind of burlesque show of craziness in the United States right now. Everything is kind of overdone and all of that. But I think what we're seeing is there's this idea that the left is good or the right is bad, or the left is bad and the right is good, or there's this idea that humans are good or bad. And I think that's such a reductive perspective. I think humans are broken. I think humans are sad. I think humans are scared more than anything. I think we see fear across all sectors right now. And I think that drives different behaviors. But what I learned growing up, being homeschooled, I was homeschooled in some very religious, conservative spaces. The kids around me were mostly not like me in those spaces. I grew up around families like the Duggars that were very, very not like me. And I think there's a fear that's driven by that. When you seek out the people who believe like you believe, who look like you look, who are on board with whatever mindset you have, it creates bigger fear when you perceive that that's going to go away. And I think that's what we're seeing with this kind of conservative movement, this America, make America great again idea. It's not so much born out of ugliness and hatred. Yes, those things are in there. Those things are part of it. But I think it's driven by fear of those who are different. And that happens when you live in that shadow side of community where everything is homogenous, where everything is that is safe to you is like you. Where those of us who grew up in communities, and I think this is why in the United States, especially, you see cities being more progressive than rural areas. Because in cities, your community is fairly diverse depending on your city, right? You're around other people. My son goes to school with every kind of kid, right? Every experience that a kid could have. And so as a mixed race Black teenager, he's comfortable. He doesn't feel unsafe, even though there are not many people like him in his school. We'll be honest, it's Denver. But there's a safety in the variation of his community. And when I think about that, and I think about people who grew up in the American rural experience, that's not necessarily the case. So I think it is natural to be scared, to stay away from the things that aren't familiar. When you apply that to corporate, I would love to hear your experience in this, but my observation is that is similar with corporate, right? If your coworkers that are closest to you in your circle look a lot like you, sound a lot like you, had experiences a lot like yours throughout their career, then it's natural to feel that is what competence looks like, that is what usefulness looks like, that's what good looks like. That's why we see so many corporations where the entire C-suite is like 80% white male, because that's your community. So you're like, oh, well, of course this guy's going to be great because he's just like these other guys. So it makes sense.
It's interesting because I would say yes and. So yeah, your perception is absolutely spot on. And I would say when you start to see the system for what it is, it's actually it's a lot more insidious from the point of view that certainly what I've witnessed over the years is those in-groups forming where, so yes, what you described, Stephanie, and that, yeah, there's only one of three people that will ever be able to be my successor, and they look like the person that agrees, the other one that agrees, and the other one that agrees. So there's actually an awful lot, there's this myth of meritocracy. And I think that's something around healthy masculinity that needs to be dealt with, I feel, which is the reality check of so many of the layers that you've already explained, right, around background, upbringing, what we look like, etc. That conversation isn't in enough spaces, I feel, within business spaces. It's all taken because, like you said earlier, fast, quick, deliver results, like that sort of done well, done in a healthy way can be really good for growing a business, growing people. But when that approach then becomes the way we do everything, so it's how we recruit, it's how we succession plan, it's how we buy another company, then suddenly you see actually, and the thing that kept coming up for me, describing actually the homogeneity was a cult. Right. Fundamentally, you're looking at community over here, which is diverse. It reinforces, it's positive, it's growth, it's uncomfortable. You're learning something versus compliance cult.
Yes.
Right. And it's not a binary, nothing is a binary, but that's what really came through strongly for me. And I can actually speak directly to that and say, yes, neoliberal capitalism is cultish. And that's a big reason why we get the tech bro behaviors that you're speaking about, I feel, Stephanie, is because the system rewards bad behavior.
Yeah. Yes. I think that's the key. I think that word that you just used, which is the system. I think what I'm learning from having the psychology background, having all these experiences with opportunities to observe how things actually become real in corporate, I think it's so easy for us to look at a broken, insidious, evil system and assume that those who work within the system are broken, evil, and insidious. And I think that's actually why more white men don't introspect. It's really hard to be introspective when by accident of nature, you are the one being supported, rewarded, and benefited by a broken system. How can you, like, very few humans can sit with that and be comfortable with, I didn't create the system, but I'm benefiting from the system. Therefore, it's my job to make myself uncomfortable. No one wants to be uncomfortable. Naturally, as humans, we don't want to do that. It's not how we're wired, but it is our only way to grow. It is our only way to, like, that's literally why we're on the earth. Is, in my opinion, we are here to learn, to be in uncomfortable situations so that we can grow. And yet it's so difficult. It is so difficult to do that. So when I look at, the men that I've worked with, I don't have resentment so much as compassion, because what I see is, when you are a beneficiary of a broken, insidious system, confronting that system is even more scary than when you are not benefited by that system. As a woman, as a Latina, I was never benefited by this system. I have struggled. I have fought. I have ruined my health over and over again to try and survive the broken, insidious system, which is why I'm motivated to break it more and change it into something that benefits everyone. But if I were supported and benefited by the system, I wouldn't necessarily have a lot of fire behind me to break it and not be benefited by it. So I think I'd love to hear your perspective on that, because I think that it's hard. If you're a CEO who makes millions of dollars a year, how can you say, hey, my millions actually, I don't deserve that? How can you be a millionaire, a billionaire, and be like, I don't actually deserve this. I should give it all away? That's not natural to human beings.
It's a beautiful, I love where you've taken us, Stepheni, because it really does speak to the heart of this platform, right? Which is, it's exactly why we're here, is to create the space for dialogue and introspection, as you said. Now, for me, and I appreciate your invitation, it's super interesting, because one of the things I hold quite often is that if we did, just imagine a situation where you waved the magic wand and it was no longer the origin of white-skinned people that we ended up where we ended up, and it happened to be another skin color, would the same behaviors be reproducing themselves or not? We'll never know. But the reality is, it was fundamentally a bunch of white men over successive generations that designed, not by accident, designed a system to be exclusionary, which means we're now where we are. So I do hold that curiosity of, like, because ultimately, regardless of the external projection, I do believe, hand on heart, that at some, it could be anybody that looks like anything that could potentially go the same direction, depending on power. However, that's not what happened, and it's not to erase the issue with whiteness, because that is the challenge of the day. But if I go on a step from that, the reason I'm able, honestly, to be able to have this conversation with you, put this platform on to try and invite other men in particular to try and look inside, to reimagine for themselves and their organizational systems, is because I've had a lot of help. I've had community. Back to your point, right? I've had a guide for the last 5 years that's been at my side, a phone call away, as I've been going, hey, Sam, this bit of work we're doing around decolonization, this bit of work we're doing around systems change, like, I've got no idea what we're doing. Okay, Gary, tell me about that. What exactly is it that you're most struggling with? I could not do that work on my own. And I think, and us men in particular, all men, but particularly us men, unless you say those white men that ultimately have never had to look in the mirror because the game's set up in our favor, right? Generally, not everybody, but generally.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that, just if I just want to weave it back a step, if we just think about what's happening right now, you say, whether it's the States, US, Europe, what I'm seeing happening and why this platform and our conversation is so important is it's the 1% of human beings who have got an awful lot of power and control, and they are desperate they're going to be relinquishing that. It's not the average CEO, it's not the average Gary or Stepheni that are the people that ultimately are going to continue to benefit, because what's going to happen is, we've already seen it, the different class structures, bit by bit, they're all being eroded and all the resource is being ripped away until it gets to everything being in the 1%'s hands.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of CEOs and other men that may hear our conversation today I genuinely believe won't see that yet. They'll be doing their best for their family, they'll be doing the best for their community, they'll be doing the best they can with the level of consciousness they have, with the tools they have in their hands. And what they probably won't see yet is that whilst they might get a little pay rise and maybe a bonus, as they stay silent at work, as they stay afraid at work, as they stay on their own, not in community, at work, more and more wealth and more resources being extracted out up to the 1%.
Yeah.
Such that they'll wake up in a decade's time and realize their kids can't afford what they could afford 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at, I feel. And that's why I'm so curious to be having this conversation within business space in particular, because these people have the opportunity and the institutional resource to do things differently. But I don't think they feel or sense things yet like we're discussing today.
I think that's 100% right. I think that there is generally an awakening. That's what I'm seeing. And what's interesting, so I'm a child of the 90s. The Matrix, big thing for my generation. I feel like there's so much truth to that idea. We do live within this structure that wasn't built by anyone really in this who's alive today, right? It was originally built by forefathers, and over time it wasn't something that they were like, okay, we're snapping our fingers and we're building this thing. It was the evolution of a taste of power and then taking more, and a taste of power and taking more, and the stories that were told throughout, right? If you look at Kendi's books, I think the reason I love him as an author is he's a historian, right? So he looks at the stories of the history of where things came from. And he points out that racism against Black human beings started with one man's story, literally a book written by one man who told the story that God had ordained this man's leader to go and enslave Black people for the benefit of their souls, right? Think about how powerful that one story had to be, where so many more people added to it. Oh yeah, and this. Oh yeah, and that, to create the situation of slavery. And I think that's the thing that actually drives me, that keeps me going in the work that I'm doing. Because if one story can make that much of a difference over time, then those of us who are waking up out of the matrix need to be telling those stories. A story can change a heart. It can change many hearts. And so to me, like, as humans, we all have the capability for empathy. We all have the capability for change. This is something my son and I talk about a lot. He's 13, and so life feels very like where he is right now, what he's doing right now, that's who he is to him. But we've talked a lot about how people change. Our bodies change, our minds change. Who I was a decade ago is absolutely not who I am now. And I think that's what we forget, right? We're like, oh, well, Trump is Trump, or so-and-so is so-and-so. Well, that's just True, yeah, people can be stubborn, people can get used to a certain thing, but everyone has the capability for change, which means that the system has a capability for change because the system doesn't exist by itself. It's upheld by all of those of us who aren't awake, who aren't aware of what's happening. So if the system can change when people change, and people can change when we hear the right story, then any single one of us who's aware, who's awake, who's ready to see things change, we just need to tell the story. And more people will be able to wake up. You or I, we didn't come at this on accident. Something happened that propelled us in this direction. And I think that's true that is a possibility for everyone. And I think what's interesting about the system that we've created over time is, to your point, the 1%, I think we so often look at the 1% as this like unknowable, rigid reality that it just is, and they just take, and we don't even know who they are, really. I mean, we have some poster children, especially in the United States tech system. We have some poster children for the 1%. But I think what's so interesting is that this system that's been created has been created to keep us compliant. And the way it keeps us compliant is it keeps us burnt out. A person who's burnt out cannot be introspective. They don't have time, energy to introspect and tear down or face their shadow. Now, our shadow's not always the bad parts of us. It's the parts of us that we don't want to face, that we don't want to be real about. And when you're burnt out, doing that work is really hard. When we go back to corporate and community, I left corporate tech because that was not my place to do the work that I know that I'm called to do, to tell the stories that I'm called to tell. But I am not of the mindset that everyone should leave corporate. That's absolutely not my mindset. In fact, some of the coaching that I'm pushing into, some of the spaces that I'm pushing into are actually corporate leadership coaching. Because what we need are leaders who create healthy, safe spaces, psychological safety for their teams, so that their teams aren't always burned out, so that their teams can have time for introspection and reflection. Because when we as humans introspect and reflect, we root out our own problems. A lot of us are not unaware of the things that are toxic about us. We just don't want to face them or think about them because we're too tired, we're too burned out, we're too scared. When we have spaces that are safe, that give us time, that allow us to cycle, then we have the energy to start facing our shadow, to start understanding the things about us that we don't like and recognizing that we can change those things. So to me, the revolution, right? The getting out of the matrix doesn't mean leaving corporate. It means our minds having time and space to change. And that's what will change the world. I think we've seen revolution in the past as a very war-driven engine, right? In order to have a revolution, somebody has to go and kill somebody. But I think that in this age, that's not the case. In this age, revolution is quiet. It's calm. It's introspective. It's embracing and loving the parts of ourselves that we're afraid of, the parts of ourselves that we don't like, and having the time and space to do that.
Wow, Stephanie, as we're going to start to wrap up our chat today, but I tell you what, that moment, oh my God, you've given so much juice today, but that moment is so powerful because I can feel the freedom. And I hope if you're listening or watching this, imagine the freedom of being able to look in the mirror, wake up every single day and know I am good enough. I am worthy. because those are the two killers, right? When you're up against it,
Yes.
you're busy, you got to perform, you got to put food on the table. When you're so disembodied that you're chasing everything outside of you, which was my journey up until I was 35,
Yeah.
right? There is no capacity to feel. And if you do feel anything, you just want to push it away or stuff it down.
Yes. Yes.
So I love what you're inviting us, which is space, slow down. And this goes for everybody, regardless of how I identify, what gender you are.
Yes.
But I do think particularly for men who are still in dominant, powerful positions, who are terrified to stop. And the markets that they represent tell them they shouldn't.
Yes. And here's the thing. The system is something that we are upholding. So men who have the power to slow it down. That's an option. That's an opportunity, because no amount of money that you make actually makes you feel better. And I think anyone who's made a ton of money will probably tell you that, if they're willing to tell themselves that, right? If they're willing to reflect, it doesn't actually, like, lives fall apart. You lose the people you care about. When you are in sole pursuit of money, it doesn't actually pay for itself. The value of the dollars aren't there in your life. You have the control, the ability to slow it down. Maybe it's just for your home, your loved ones, your local community. Maybe it's for your work community. You can be the leader that slows things down, that learns how to create psychological safety for your team, so that your team can flourish, can reflect, so that you can flourish and reflect. So many people exercise every day, learn new things, or like, so that you can keep your brain active, right? Keep your mind, keep your body active. But what about that internal space? Your internal space needs that too, needs that level of dedication, needs that level of care. If you are willing to give your body care, to give your bank account, your financial life care, then giving your internal space care is absolutely essential. And as you do that, as you give space for your teams to do that, your loved ones, your local community to do that, that continues to have that ripple effect, where those people can then create that space for their communities, for their people. I think leaders have the kind of power that can change the world. And all that's needed at this moment is for that, just stop for a moment and recognize that the only thing that can overcome fear is that pure and perfect love. And it has to start with yourself. There's I think so many white men, not just white men, so many men in general, people in power, regardless of gender or intersectionality, have this sense of, I have to keep going because I don't love me. So I have to gain money, I have to gain love, I have to gain adoration, I have to gain acclaim. But when you stop for just a moment and recognize that you are worthy just because you exist, and whether you exist with white skin, brown skin, whether you exist as male, female, non-binary, queer, just because you exist, you have value. You are important. And whether you are someone who has millions of dollars in the bank account or hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, you still have value. You still matter because you exist. And when we can love ourselves with that kind of certainty, with that kind of simplicity, then the fear starts to just not be powerful anymore. It's that simple.
I think that mic drop moment is probably the perfect time for us to wrap up today, Stepheni.
Yeah,
Wow.
absolutely.
Wow. Well, I've been sharing, for those that are listening on the podcast, Stepheni, STEPHENIM.com, or you can find Stepheni Mendez on LinkedIn. Stepheni, ENI, Mendez, one word, on LinkedIn. Go and hunt with love. I just realized the metaphor I was about to share. Go and find Stepheni, please don't hunt her down. Please go and find her on her social media.
I'm here.
You don't have
to hunt me.
Yeah. But thank you so much for sharing your journey. Thank you so much for sharing some really beautiful examples of the benefits of balancing the healthier masculinity with the feminine energies, with possibility, and helping us remember that it starts with us. It isn't out there, Stepheni. So I want to give you the last word. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners or viewers with as you head off into the rest of your day?
I think the last word, nothing in the world is as amazing as of an experience as self-love. Absolutely nothing. Millions of dollars, the love of an amazing person, none of that is quite as amazing as the feeling of completely loving yourself. It's completely worth it. It's worth anything and everything that you might need to give up. And you probably won't have to give up that much because it's all inside you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Stepheni. And thank you everyone for listening and watching. Take care.